The idea of this GeoTalk is to talk about Yemen, to talk about the context in Yemen, to François Burgat to explain to us, to give us an external vision of what are the actors, what is the Yemen today, to try to us to understand a little bit better this country, and also try to define or at least to give some idea on the potential scenario we will face on the coming weeks. As you know, the situation is really tricky right now in Yemen. Just to tell you that the team are okay there. We are still working, even if it's really complicated. But we need to have some more information and more visibility to see on the coming weeks and coming months what will be feasible to do.
Before we start addressing dark sides of the situation in Yemen, allow me a private, personal statement. When the old Francois is asked, where did you spend the best of your life? The answer comes right away, it's in Yemen. Yemen is a beautiful country with a lot of beautiful people, nice, friendly relations with foreigners. So this is where we start from, and we should not forget, okay? Now, the challenge that I am facing this morning is to wrap up an incredibly complicated situation in half an hour. I don't know if I will succeed, but I will try. Especially if since I want to take you 1,000 years ago to start with, but we will soon be back in a more contemporary, but I need to tell you that almost 1,000 years ago, over 1,000 years ago, a guy came from Iran, remember the name, and started a dynasty of, which ended as being a monarchy in 1936 of imams, and their political ideology was linked to Zaydism, and Zaydism can be related to Shiism. So I need this word. I need Iran, I need Shia, and I need this continuity, 1,000 years, people, not dominated, people ruled the Yemen until 1962. So we are back in a more contemporary perspective, 1962 to 1970, under the attack of what was labeled at that time Arab nationalism or secularist Arab nationalism, you know, brought up by a gentleman by the name of Gamal Abdel Nasser. They put an end, a civil war put an end to the hegemony of the Shia Zaydi monarchy, which had ruled the Yemen for 1,000 years. Just a little parenthesis, these rulers of the northern Yemen, they had to face two visitors, Ottomans, who came twice and were kicked out of Yemen in 1911. And the specificity of Yemen is very important. In 1911, when the Ottomans started crumbling, falling apart, no Western power came, just like it happened in Syria or in Lebanon. There was no mandate from France or Great Britain. So a special taste of Yemen, which is important to you, is that there is no colonial background, at least in the north, because they faced also another visitor, the British. The British came in 1839 and made this South Yemen under the colonial rule of the British. But remember one thing, when the British moved in, Aden was empty. Most of the population, they came from the north. So we must not exaggerate this dichotomy of Yemen between the north and the south. The north is more important. The entire spirit of Yemen came from the mountains of the north, these beautiful mountains of the north. When we look at the map, remember that between Hodeidah and Sana'a, people say, travelers say that you can go through 3 seasons. If you're in Sana'a, you may be in winter, then you go to spring, and then you go to summer, because there is 2,300 meters high. And if you want to do a good trick to your friends who visit you in Sana'a, you challenge them in a swimming pool. You who have been living months in Sana'a, you will destroy them because they cannot breathe at 2,350 meters. There's a huge difference. I would say that in Sana'a, when your hand is in the shadow, it's cold, you put it in the sun, it burns. It's a very nice climate. But you must remember that these mountains have protected the country of foreign influences, and Yemen was sometimes referred to as Tibet de la Mer Rouge, the Tibet of the Red Sea. You know, it was completely protected. This is important. The relation to foreigners is both influenced by this absence of colonization and this very protected, very conservative environment. I like Arab friends telling me when arriving in Yemen, I have the feeling that I have arrived in the house of my grandfather. You know, it looks like what people thought was the Arab world. When you travel to Yemen, you not only travel in geography, you travel in history. This is a very banal assessment. In 1970 started a regime which has lasted until now, until 20th of January. A mixture of Arab nationalist ideology where the sectarian divide, Shia, Sunni, did not interfere. For years, being Shiite was identified to being part of the regime which had been defeated in between 1962 and 1970. So it was not a political resource to say I'm a Shia. So there was no, religion was influencing political forces, but not in the sense of the sectarian divide between Shia and Sunni. And this is very important. This is what is coming to an end. This good old time of non-sectarian politics is coming to an end. This regime, born in 1970, but whose Ali Abdallah Saleh has taken control of in 1978, has lasted all this time. And Ali Abdallah Saleh, even after he was more or less defeated by the young revolutionaries in 2011, he stayed in power. No one knows, but the Congrès Général du Peuple, the General Popular Congress, is still in power until now, until it has been defeated by the Houthis last January. So there is a lot of continuity. To make it very short, we shall say that this regime has two kinds of opposition. A political parliamentarian opposition, which is represented by tiny leftist parties, some of them related to the former regime of the South Yemen when the British left. But the main opposition to this regime born in 1970, transformed in 1980, was El-Islah, the party El-Islah, which we define by two ways. They had aggregated the tribes, which are a very important element, and the ideology was close to Ikhwan al-Muslimin, Muslim Brotherhood. Okay? This mixture was the major opposition to the regime until now. So we have the people related to the imama, we have the regime, we have the opposition, the legalist opposition. And now, recently on a website called Grotius, I have labeled an article, The Two Yemen. One Yemen is transformed by a difficult, sophisticated political process. People, they discuss national dialogue, they reform, they make a new constitution. There is a regional and international influence, but this process is endogenous, okay? And it has been moving forward. And it's not so often that the entire international community, that means us, you know, the Westerners and Russia, we agreed in supporting this political process of transforming institutions, moving toward what could be a federal constitution, dividing the country in 6 provinces. It was moving in, slowly, but it was moving in. But there is another Yemen. It's the Yemen which is born not in September 9/11, 1 year before. We in Yemen, we started everything 1 year before. We had the assault of US coal in Aden, 17 young, I don't know why I say young, because soldiers are young, and it's not the fact that they are young which make them legitimate. These soldiers, they were on a warship participating in the embargo on Iraq, which we knew at that time had already caused 500,000 casualties among children of Iraq. But they were assaulted by what was considered the first major Al-Qaeda action in Yemen. And Yemen entered this period of history where he had to link with the US pressure, get us rid of these guys. And this is another Yemen where there is a war, where there is no political process, where there is no institutions, there is only war, blind war. And a major point I want to suggest to you is that those warriors whom we consider as extremists, Al-Qaeda warriors, they used to be extremists in the sense that they were at the extreme periphery of the political system. The trend we are facing now, and we are not facing it only in Yemen, it's exactly what has happened in Iraq. It's exactly what has happened in Syria. It's more or less what has happened in Mali. It might be related to the situation of Boko Haram, but I do not address this issue since I have not been working there. It is the fact that the extremists, they get into synergy with compartments of the population, which consider that there is no way out of the crisis, there is no way out of being the left, les laissés pour compte, the leftovers of the political system. So they move and they ally to the more radicals. And this is what might happen in Yemen. This is what we are on the verge on. This is one of the dangers. Now, I know I'm going to run out of time, but I want you to remember that the worst is not the only possible future in Yemen. There is also a chance that the discussion going on in Movenpick Hotel nowadays come to a fruitful end, and that the government represented by Mansour al-Hadi, the elected president, agrees with some kind of agreement with the Houthis. Okay, so there is a legal opposition, then there is a radical opposition. Then came the Arab Spring, February 9, 2011, and the revolutionary youth started a movement. The characteristic of the movement of the Yemeni Spring is that these young people who started the job, they were immediately supported by the traditional opposition, the Islah, whom I have mentioned, the Qaba'il, the tribes, and with the Ikhwan Muslimin ideology. And then, and this is very specific to Yemen, they were supported by part of the army who defected and supported a balance of forces where the revolution had the support of a huge compartment of the society, including the army. With the support of the regional monarchies, they came to a balance of power where they forced Ali Abdullah Saleh out of power, but not completely. He stepped from the Manassa, from the power, and he gave the power to his vice president. So, you know, it was not too much of a revolution. And his party stayed the party in power. But he brought in the traditional opposition of Islah. So we were in a strange situation where there had been a revolution, but the revolution was still, the old forces were still in power. I gave a personal example. I was in Yemen last January 2014 with one of my young colleagues. We lived together in Yemen. He wrote the report for Crisis Group in 2007. Therefore, he was banned from entering Yemen. So when we arrived in Yemen in January 2014, we said, hey, we come after the revolution. So those who were banned before the revolution, they will be allowed in after the revolution. But he stayed outside. He stayed in the airport. And he was kicked out of the country. I myself have the same problem when I moved to Tunis. I'm very proud of it. I have this medal of being prohibited to enter Tunis since 1994. There was not so many people at that time who were opposing the dark side of the regime. Anyway, we have this strange midterm revolution. Keep it in mind, okay? Now, my last category of activists, and we go back to the first point.
the Houthis. But beware of how they were born. And I was in Yemen at that time, and I wrote specifically on the after 2011, the Americans came in and I say, they hesitated. Do we bomb Yemen, or do we break the arm of the regime and ask him to fight with us? They chose the second solution. They kept Ali Abdullah Saleh, but they told him, you open every archive, you let us in everywhere. And this produced a reaction among the population. And in the north, a few guys started saying, down with the US, down with Israel, long life to Islam. This was a good old anti-imperialist discourse. It was not a sectarian discourse in the sense that it was not a pro-Shia discourse. But the regime, to discredit this enemy from the north, instead of saying, okay, I'm going to improve my relations with the States, he said, you are supported by Iran. You are supporters of the old imamat. You want to restore the regime, which at that time was not true. Anyway, there was a long war with these people, these rebels of the north, okay? The vicious side of the situation, the very pragmatic side of the situation, is that Ali Abdullah Saleh, who had fought them, who had introduced the sectarian divide in the landscape, he allied with them. He allied with them to restore his power, to struggle against the part of the army connected to Al-Islah, which had betrayed him in his mind, and we had brought the situation for him to step out of power. Now, let's move outside Yemen and briefly say what is the attitude of the regional activists. The Saudis and the Emirates, you can put them in the same basket. The Saudis, contrary to what often people think, they don't have a religious agenda. They have a very basic agenda. They want to stay in power. They want to stay in power, and they are ready for alliances with anyone, including the so-called Shia enemy. So during the last years, we have seen very clearly Saudi Arabia supporting the Houthis who were struggling against Muslim Brotherhood. Because the Saudis, they have two enemies, the radicals and the moderate. And you know which are the ones they fear more? The moderate. They fear the democratic menace. They fear the ballot boxes. So the paradox is that the Saudis have most probably allowed the Houthis to make this military campaign, which has ended almost in September 2014, when they started their control of Sana'a, and which has dramatically evolved the last 20th of January, when they have taken control of the presidential palace. That's where we are now. That's where we are now. For a few days, the reaction of the international community was not very clear, because many people have a paradoxical agenda when it comes to Yemen. The Saudis, they are afraid of Ikhwan al-Muslimin, so those, even if they are Shia, who take the Ikhwan al-Muslimin out of power, they are good guys. We Westerners, we look at the Houthis as exactly as the US is looking at Iran nowadays in the frame of the struggle against Daesh. When we have partners from the Shiite, we have a kind of guarantee that they are going to be really tough against Al-Qaeda. They do not do it because they support the foreign policy of the US. They do it because there is a sectarian divide. Al-Qaeda, they are Sunnis, and the Houthis, they are Shiite. So there is a paradox in the attitude of both regional and international forces, since we know that the Iranian planes fly over Iraq nowadays, hand in hand, if I may say, hand in hand with the US. So the last 2 days, what are the news? The international community has made a clear statement. They do not want the Houthis to break this political process I have evolved. They want that the Houthis stop their military control of the situation. They have not accepted what and also the regional monarchies, the Saudis, the Emirates, they have asked for military intervention under Chapter 7 of United Nations. So they have clearly stated that they are no longer with this idea of supporting the takeover of the Houthis. That's where we are now, okay? What we know is what the actors have done during the past weeks, months and years. What we do not know is what is going to happen tomorrow. But what we can expect is the worst and the less worst. The worst is that this very vicious process by which the Sunnis will coordinate or ally with the most radical activists in the south, in the name of their being Sunni, and in the name of the power in Sana'a being Shia, this would be the worst. This would bring, I hate to mention it, but I have been following the Syrian crisis, and at the beginning we were so many saying, no, it will not go to the extent that the sectarian divide will become a major parameter, and it has become, okay? So we must consider the worst. The worst is that this very vicious process redividing the Yemen, and maybe I forgot to say, the Shia, they are 1/3 of the population. The majority is Sunni, okay? But the former elite, they are the Shia, because they were linked to the rulers for so many years. So you have this dichotomy, okay? You have a physical geography dichotomy. You have an old divide between south, and north, which might be reactivated under a religious label, because the Sunnis would be moving towards south. And if you see the map, you probably see the presence of the Houthis in brown. Okay, you see this coming from Saada toward Ib. Now, when it comes to your concern, we might segregate between two parts of the country: the parts where the Houthis have completed their military campaign. They are more or less, there is no more resistance, and the rest of the country where there might be resistance. I hope they will not call it Houthi Sunni resistance. I hope they will call it partners of the political process resistance. Of course, when the young people demonstrate in Sana'a, they do not say we are Sunnis. They say we are the revolution. We are the institutionalized expression of the revolution, and we want to move forward on this institutional base. In Sana'a, the divide is not sectarian. Some people, and I spoke to many of my friends there, some people consider the Houthis were not so bad guys. They had restored some kind of security in the city. They were not behaving as plain sectarian activists. But you know that these Tawakkul Karman, I'm very proud when I mentioned the name of Tawakkul Karman, because I was part of those who wrote for the Nobel Prize, for her to get the Nobel Prize. I signed this report, so I feel some kind of responsibility. But Tawakkul Karman, the Nobel Prize in Peace Prize in 2011, 2 days after the moving in of the Houthis, she referred to Yemen as the country occupied by Iran. So, you know, we have moved in a mirror, and I was mentioning when the Houthis, they destroyed the house. Today you have everything in video, so you can see in video the Houthis destroying the house of the leader, symbolic house of the leadership of Islah and the tribes. They say they destroyed the house of the Sunni, the Asad al-Sunni, the lion of the Sunnis. So you know, this vocabulary of the sectarian divide is part of the landscape. You must remember that the Saudis, they don't have a religious or ideological agenda. The Saudis, for instance, they supported the communists in the south against the more religious people in the north. So they are very pragmatic. But since 3 days, they have one unique position which has brought the Security Council to take a very strong resolution 3 days ago. The Houthis have refused. They say, no, we express the needs and the will of the people and blah, blah, blah. They have been trying to institutionalize of course, they never represent themselves as a sectarian-based political activist. They insist upon the fact that they have been part of the revolutionary process, which more or less they have been. They were in Tahrir Square. You know why Tahrir Square? Because there is a Tahrir Square in Yemen, and Tahrir is the symbol of this square, Midan, which has been used in Egypt. So what did the Yemeni regime did? He prevently occupied the Tahrir Square to prevent the protesters, the revolutionaries, to make use of the symbol. So the revolutionary youth, they mobilized another square, and they called it Midan Tahrir, which means the change. So they couldn't use liberation, which is Tahrir, so they used Midan change. The specificity of the Arab Spring in Yemen is that part of the army joined the Arab Spring. This has been put to an end. They have crushed this part, this general, and they have brought back the army under the control. If you want to know what is the situation in the army, you must just watch the videos of how easy it was for the Houthis to enter Sana'a. It means that major segment of the armies were still linked to Ali Abdullah Saleh, and Ali Abdullah Saleh's role has been to facilitate, and they have proof. You know, it's been published on Al Jazeera. You have Ali Abdullah Saleh on the phone coordinating with commanders of Houthis. So we know that huge components of the army are in the hand of Ali Abdullah Saleh, which means in the hand of the Houthis. Only the presidential guard was trustful to the new president, and these are those who have defended the palace. But the rest of them, I mean, there is no balance, there is no military balance in the hand of the forces which have moved forward with the institutional process. They are weak when it comes to the balance of armed balance forces. The arms are in the hand of the Houthis. And on the other side are the radical Al-Qaeda. But in between, the national dialogue partners are defeated militarily. And once again, it was so easy for the Houthis to enter Sana'a in September, and so easy early January to control the presidential palace. Once again, the answer should be differentiated with different parts of the territory. I spoke to a friend in Sana'a the day before yesterday. I said, how's it? You move around? There's no direct tension now in Sana'a. You can move around, you can drive. There's no shooting. It has ended. But there is shooting in many other places, and we said including Aden. The civil society, although this concept is very dangerous, was mainly involved in the constitutional process, in the national dialogue. All these people, they feel dispossessed of their efforts, since all of a sudden we start all over again with a new military balance. Now, what type of violence? When the Houthis moved into Sana'a in September, for instance, they broke in the house of Tawakkul Karman, ruined the house. They broke in the symbols of the Islah party's houses, and made some provocation. It was not full violence. It has nothing to do with the Syrian conflict. It was not there's a lot of violence by Al-Qaeda when they move in. There were 56 persons killed in the
hospital area in Sana'a last August. But between the Houthis and the rest of the population, we are not now at the, there is an accusation that one protester has been tortured. One person, one incident. It's not massive violence like it would be in the case of Syria. We are not dealing about this. I often used to say that the level of violence in Yemen was much lower than in societies like Iraq or Libya, or in Libya I visited, you remember the name of this place, where 1,276 persons were shot in just 2 hours. You don't have this type of massacre. And I would often quote a turning point in Yemen, people came, they have put a lady in jail. It was just too much. The society was not used that a lady could be put in jail on a political accusation. Good. So the society of Yemen had not this level of blind violence. And some of the reasons why, I don't know if I created this concept, but I used it. I don't know if someone used it before, but I wrote a piece about the armed civil society, la société civile en armes. The society in Yemen was carrying weapons. So they were in a situation, not like the Tunisians, not like the Egyptians, to resist whenever the state was moving across the borders of not respecting the society. I remember whatever, rape or some kind of this story, and the accusation was against a high-ranking civil servant in Sana'a. The tribes, they move out and they cut the road. They cut the road for 1 day, 2 days, 3 days until justice comes. So the level of violence in the Yemeni society before the episode of Al-Qaeda was not to be compared to what has occurred before, much before, in Iraq and in Syria. Now the situation is not fully dramatic in Sana'a. I spoke to a young lady with a poet. She said, we hope that the people in Mozambique, they come to an agreement. There's still this idea that the political process could be transferred to the discussions and restored. The Houthis say that they want so. The Houthis wanted the president to stay in power, but they wanted to put the pressure on him. They wanted him to sign laws and decrees that they would write, and he refused, and he left his post for this reason. So there is still the idea that there would be a lucky, happy end of this present situation, and a political landscape where the Houthis would have a prime minister or something like this. But we would stay in the frame of this first Yemen, the Yemen who negotiate is institutionalized solution, and not move into what I've labeled the second Yemen, this Yemen where drones come and kill, and of course those who are killed, they kill they cannot kill the drivers of the drones, the pilots of the drones, so they kill the representatives of the regime who allows, because the regime allows the Americans to use this type of means. So the dark side would be that this binary divide, like it is now in Iraq. The dark future would be an Iraqi future. I do not support the idea that so many people have many people have left the Houthis, moved in. But at least since the last 3 days, we have a clear answer of the Gulf monarchies and of, I will move to the economy, to the donors. Yemen, one gate of understanding Yemen, it is 100, it used to be 138, I don't know if it's 140 on the list of wealth. It is a very, very poor country. It is very influential, it is very influenced by regional donors. The Saudis, they were working with the tribes with money. So those who are asking that they go back to, they leave power or they accept negotiated access to power, they have a strong voice because they are
the oil money of the entire region. Now it is the sound which comes of the regime, God knows, maybe under the table. When you deal with Saudi Arabia, you must never forget that the regime is one thing, the people inside the country, they might be opposing to the regime. When I hear the sound that Saudi Arabia supports Daesh, I say stupid, totally stupid. Saudi Arabia is afraid of Daesh. But all those who oppose the Saud, all those who are who look at the Saud like partners of the West, overflowing the markets of oil, contrary to the interest, they might have, and we know that many Saudi citizens are involved in radical groups. So the regimes, the people in power in the entire peninsula, they are opposing the Houthis. So they are those who are going to ask them to leave power. Their voice, of course on the other side we did not mention, but Iran, most probably, I hated to say so, but Iran now is a partner of the situation in Yemen. A very provocative statement, I need to check, but a high-ranking Iranian official repeatedly wrote 2 months ago that we control 3 and soon 4 Arab capitals. Lebanon through Hezbollah, Baghdad through Maliki, Damascus through Bashar al-Assad, and Yemen, Sana'a through the Houthis. So there is this idea that the Houthis might be financially supported by Iran, but there is at least a clear statement of the entire international community, including Russia, with a little tiny nuance from Russia, is that Russia is not very supportive of United Nations interventions, because if he would accept them in this part of the planet, he would have to accept them in another part of the planet closer to his borders. I'm not capable of forecasting I can identify the activist. I can say what the strategy has been for the past weeks. It's very difficult to move forward. Once again, there are 2 ways out of the crisis. The good way is that the talks which are being, which are presently held in Movenpick Hotel on top of Sana'a, bring a compromise where the military power, the military supremacy, hegemony of the Houthis would be more or less taken into consideration in the new political formula. If not, I'm afraid we are moving towards a situation where the sectarian and the regional divide will play a role in the coming weeks, because immediately after the takeover of the Houthis, you had calls from Aden and Hadramaut to move away. This is part of the history of Yemen. Yemen has not always been unified, so there is always the temptation that the solution would be just like we have the temptation that moving out of Europe, it will be easier if we go back to the village. I think it's completely counterproductive. But these voices exist in Yemen. As early as the 21st of January, you had calls from Aden that all high-ranking officers should move down to. They have experienced this. I've not mentioned this period of reuniting the Yemen in 1990. It lasted 4 years and then it split. People tried and reinstored South Yemen. So this is one of the dangers, except that this South Yemen would not be only on a geographical base, but it might be also on a sectarian, the expression of a sectarian device, which is worse. I think that the Houthis, they want to convince the Western environment that they are good guys. I see no reason why the Houthis should take a tough stance, the kind of stance they would have taken when they were in opposition toward Westerners. They are going to play the role. We are the good guys. We are fighting Al-Qaeda much better than the previous regime would do it, because this was part of their, on the 20th of January, Abdel Malik al-Houthi said one of the accusations of the regime he was toppling was they said that they were struggling against Al-Qaeda, but they let them do everything. They were not really, they were close to them. So if the Houthis take over, more than ever the bad guys will be Al-Qaeda. And we know that for Al-Qaeda, it's hard to say, but there is no strict recognition of humanitarian workers. We have had demonstrations recently. I have been involved many occasions in this type of assessment for Red Cross in Switzerland. They had a trauma when in Afghanistan they had someone killed long ago, 10 years ago, maybe you remember. It was a symbolic step, very important, and they had to reflect upon the idea: are we or not legitimate? Where are the borders of our legitimacy as intervention? Now, I would say that we are moving very toward a more difficult situation. I have myself lived the situation of kidnappings in Yemen, good old kidnappings. We had a lot. I had two of my researchers kidnapped, but it was a good old kidnapping. It was, I take a foreigner because I want to school or my nephew to get out of jail. It was not hostile to the people kidnapped. Then I attended, if I may say, the first political tragic end in 1998, when 4 tourists were killed, but they were killed during the assault by the non-professionalized police forces. They were not executed. But we do know that this period of globalization has brought this new mean of action, which is to executing Westerners or people considered as such. And I cannot ignore this. I cannot ignore this. So I say, the Houthis, I don't think that they will be tough on humanitarian workers, because they need to get the respect. And they are moving, the Shiite, the sons of Khomeini are moving out of illegitimacy. But the son of Ben Laden, they are moving into more and more difficult relation with the West, if I may simplify. But this is really the situation. We are moving toward Iran. We are considering that Iran will help us fight the Sunni radicals. I think it is a stupid attitude, but that's what we are doing. For this reason, situation in Yemen, I would say, the attitude of Al-Qaeda, and they are on the raise, will be a very clear red light toward Westerners or foreigners. The jihadis should not be linked only to the Syrian opposition. The Syrian regime has also mobilized sectarian divide to mobilize Iraqis and Yemenis. So this is the first part. Now, I don't think that the Syrian, the people coming back from Syria is a main part of the landscape. Why? Because the radicals, in the Sunni radicals, it's their homeland, the Yemen, for very specific historical reasons. Yemen is probably the first at the contemporary level, the first place where people started jihad against the West, or jihad against the westernized political forces. When did it start? It started because in South Yemen, you had a unique experience, the only Marxist regime in the Arab world. The only explicitly Marxist regime existed right after the British left. And the reaction, the opposition to this British regime was very early in the name of religion. You had jihadis struggling against the communist regime in the south. These jihadis, they were instrumentalized by the regime of the north. This is where it becomes very complicated, to struggle against the regime of the south. So before the unification of 1990 and even after, those jihadis, they were a weapon in the hand of the regime of Dali Abdallah Saleh to find his opponents. This is the reason why when Cole attack and 11th of September occurred, Ali Abdallah Saleh found himself in a very bad position, because the US started saying, hey, you are so closely linked to these jihadist groups, okay? So for this reason, Yemen has not exported many warriors to Syria, and it does not need people coming back from Syria to become jihadis. The jihad started, the means of action, the vocabulary started there. Huh? And you know Awlaqi, Anwar Awlaqi, the guy who is supposedly responsible for sponsoring the attack in Paris, or part of the attack in Paris, has no lessons to take from what's happening in Syria. There are two considerations when it comes to who is going to Syria. Those who have an enemy in front of them, the Palestinians, the Egyptians in Sinai. They don't feel that they have to go and fight in Syria. Those who go and fight in Syria are those where there is no immediate enemy, no possibility of action in their own country. But I oppose some understanding by some of my colleagues who say the Israeli-Arab conflict has nothing to do with jihadism. And the reason for me to say so is that you see no Palestinian fighting in Syria. I said the Palestinians, they are fighting in Gaza. They don't have to go and fight elsewhere. And the same for the Egyptians who are fighting in Sinai. You have 3,000 maybe now fighting in Sinai. So Yemen did not have to import any model from Iraq since he was the homeland of jihad to a certain extent.